What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting slash build video, and today we're going to be discussing Alkosh and Torug's Pact, two very popular tank sets, very popular tank utility sets that provide additional penetration or resistance debuffs to the enemy. Now there's been a lot of discussion in many of my guilds as to which one is superior to the other, and so today I'm just kind of going to give you guys a little bit of information that I think might be useful when you guys are deciding amongst yourselves and amongst your guilds whether or not you want to use Alkosh or Torugs, or maybe even both combined. Now, for those of you guys who don't know which sets I'm talking about, Torug's Pact is a crafted set. It requires 3 traits in order to craft. It's in the base game, so you don't need to have any access to DLCs or any expansions or things like that in order to make it. It does come from the second zone in each of your alliance areas, so that would be, let me see, it'd be Deshawn, Grotwood, and, let me think, DC, Stormhaven. So that's where you can find the crafting station for Torug's Pact. Now, Torug's Pact, the 2-piece adds spell damage, 3-piece adds max health, 4-piece adds spell resistance, so obviously the spell damage we're not going to really care too much about as a tank. The 3-piece max health is always nice, and then the spell resistance helps out our survivability by giving us a little bit more resistance to spell damage. And the 5-piece decreases weapon enchant cooldown and increases potency by 30%. Now the 5-piece is not affected by item quality, so even if it's green or gold, the 5-piece effect will always remain the same. It'll always be 30%. So Torug's Pact is very powerful because you can see here on the Crusher enchant, we get a debuff of 2740 for 5 seconds. This is also combined with an infused weapon trait as well. So the standard Crusher enchant is a 1622 resistance debuff. With an infused, it becomes 2108, and with Torug's Pact, it becomes 2740. And of course, the Crusher enchant has a cooldown. Of course, the default cooldown is 10 seconds. With an infused, it drops down to 5 seconds, and then with a Torug's Pact infused, it drops down to 3.5 seconds. So Torug's Pact with a infused Crusher enchant, it is possible to have 100% uptime on this 2740 reduction in physical and spell resistance. So that's why Torug's Pact, even though the set bonuses don't necessarily make it seem like a tanking set, is a very potent tanking set, because you can pretty much guarantee 2740 resistance debuff on the boss at pretty much all times. Now, Torug's Pact does come with some disadvantages. The primary one being that because it is an enchant, there is no reliable way to apply the Crusher enchant across multiple enemies. So for trash fights, even if you're using, for example, a lightning staff bar, as some tanks in the endgame are doing now, it'll only ever apply that enchant to one enemy at a time, and it's always going to be the enemy that's closest to you. So the Crusher enchant in Torug's Pact, it's very good for single targets, but it's not so great for trash fights where you have a lot of enemies. You could, of course, go around and smack each one with your sword in order to apply the enchant. But the enchant does have a cooldown of 3.5 seconds, so you'd have to hit each enemy within 3.5 seconds of each other in order to apply the Crusher enchant. And so it's not very reliable that way, because by the time you hit the second enemy or third enemy with the Crusher enchant on the first enemy has already kind of expired. So that's kind of the problem with Torug's Pact. It's very great for a consistent single target DPS burn, but for trash fight it's not as good as Alkosh, which we're going to be talking about next. So Alkosh, right here, comes from Maw of Lorcage, which is a trial. You do need the Thieves Guild DLC in order to access it, so you need to have either Thieves Guild or ESO Plus in order to get Alkosh. It is a medium armor set, so it only comes in medium armor. So for tanks, you'll typically see tanks use Alkosh on the jewelry pieces and then the sword and shield. You can, however, sometimes see tanks using the belt or the gloves as an armor piece in order to get their 511, their 1 medium piece in. That's kind of less common. The more common, you just see the weapons and jewelry. So Alkosh, we don't really care about the 2, 3, and 4-piece effects, because honestly they're not really important for tanks. It's weapon crit, minor slayer, and weapon damage, all of which pretty much don't matter to tanks. The 5-piece is what really matters and what makes this a tanking set versus a strictly DPS set. When you activate a synergy, you send a shockwave from your position that deals 2150 physical damage and additional 15890 physical damage over 10 seconds. It reduces the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 30-10 for 10 seconds, and this is of course with all gold quality, so the 5-piece does scale with item quality. So if you have, let's say, blue jewelry and gold sword and shield, it won't be 30-10, it'll probably be something like 2940 or 2920, something like that. So unlike Torugs, Alkosh, the 5-piece does scale based on item quality. Now the Alkosh is great for, it actually provides the largest debuff when combined with an infused crusher enchant. Let me find my Alkosh sword. So here you can see, oh, I have to actually, let me just unequip Torugs, so you're getting the Torugs one. So here's Alkosh. So with infused crusher with the 2108 added on top of the Alkosh debuff of 30-10, provides the largest debuff of any set in the game. Just combined is a 5118 physical and spell resistance debuff, which is very, very large. Now the downside of using Alkosh is that it only activates when you use a synergy, which makes you obviously very reliant on synergies. So for the typical synergies that you'll get in a trial are going to be energy orbs from your healer, shards from your healer if you have Templar healers. If you have Maxworks in group, you'll have liquid lightning that has a conduit synergy. If you have Templar healers, you can use the Purify from Extended Ritual. That's another potential synergy that you can use. And then there are other kind of random synergies that some classes have. For example, if you have any DKs, DPS, they're using Standard, there's a synergy associated with Standard. There are a couple of additional synergies you can use. Warden healers, Budding Seeds does have a synergy associated with it. So there are a couple of synergies you can use. However, the primary synergies that you'll be using as a tank in the trials are going to be orbs, shards, and liquid lightning, the conduit synergy. So because you're going to be very reliant on synergies, it's going to be very difficult to maintain 100% uptime on Alkosh. In fact, only very highly coordinated groups are able to attain anything higher than 60 to 70% uptime on Alkosh. On non-coordinated groups or on groups that don't really focus much on maintaining Alkosh uptime, it is actually fairly difficult to get above 50% uptime on Alkosh. So theoretically, if you space out your synergies, your orbs, and let's say a conduit synergy from Maxorg, it is possible to get 100% uptime on Alkosh. If you have 2 tanks running Alkosh, you can even stagger it out. You have a little bit more leeway, so it is possible to stagger your synergies with Alkosh in order to get 100% uptime. But it is very, very difficult to do so. You need a lot of coordination between the tanks, and it's just not something that you see happen very often. Even the best guilds in the game, even like Mechanically Challenged and Dragon's Crest on the EU server, even they have trouble maintaining 100% uptime on Alkosh. So that's kind of the downside of Alkosh. Now, an upside of Alkosh is that it is an AoE debuff. So the shockwave does reach out a fair distance. It's not quite as doesn't reach quite as far as Blockade of Fire or Blockade of Storms or Comet Prayer, but it does reach a considerable distance, and it does hit each enemy that the shockwave manages to hit, so it does apply an AoE debuff. So that's kind of the advantage of Alkosh. If you activate a synergy and you have a bunch of adds lined up, you can hit all of them with Alkosh, which makes it a pretty strong set that way. But again, that uptime is kind of what matters the most. So speaking of uptimes, I did do a couple of tests looking at Alkosh uptimes in various scenarios here. So all these parses down here were done with either 1 tank with Alkosh or 2 tanks with Alkosh. So first we're going to be taking a look at 2 Zatsu parses from Ruins of Mazatoon. That's the first boss in Ruins of Mazatoon. So if we take a look at debuffs out here, we can see we got a Roar of Alkosh is the debuff you'll be looking at, and you have a 37% uptime here. If we take a look at the second one, we have an uptime of, gotta highlight it, we have an uptime of 28%. Now, the way that I use to calculate average debuff from Alkosh is basically, I take the uptime as a percentage, so in this case 28%, and multiply that by whatever the debuff is. So I have, let me quickly put on my Alkosh set. So my Alkosh set, for example, reduces by 2940. So I would just multiply that 28, so 0.28 times the 2940. That gives me 823, and I add that on to the 2108 crusher uptime. That gives me 2931. So that's actually the effective penetration that you're getting, the debuff that you're getting from using Alkosh. Now remember that the Torugs Pact debuff is 2740. So even with a 28% uptime, Alkosh is beating Torugs Pact, but it's only beating it by just barely 200 additional debuff, additional penetration. Remember that 660 penetration is what you need for every 1%, in theory, a 1% increase in DPS. So a 200 additional penetration over Torugs, when it's not up all the time, it's kind of, it's a hard sell in some scenarios. But that's just looking at one tank on a 4-man dungeon with just a Templar healer, no max work. So what if we take a look at a Trials parse? We have a lot more max works, for instance. So this is a Stone Atronach parse from Vet AA. I'm on a Stam DK here. So we're taking a look at Stone Atronach, right? Take a look for Alkosh. Alkosh here only had a 32% uptime. So again, we want to take 32.32, multiply it by 2940, and you get 3048. So again, you're only beating it by about 300 penetration, so you're only really getting 0.5% on average compared to Torugs. Remember, Torugs, you can get a very consistent, almost 100% uptime on Crusher. And if you take into consideration that even with an infused weapon on Alkosh, you're not going to be able to get 100% uptime on Crusher all the time, because it's a 5-second cooldown on a 5-second duration. So it is, while theoretically it's possible to get 100% uptime, it's still kind of difficult to do so, just because you will be swapping bars and doing things like that. You might be blocking during a mechanic or something, so it's a more accurate uptime for Crusher on infused Alkosh is probably closer to 90%, so it's probably going to be a little bit lower than this even. So that's something else that you also want to consider. So in this particular parse, we're looking at only 300 additional penetration over Torugs, which, you know, is again, it's a hard sell to make. If we take a look at let's see, what's a good one? Valarial. Valarial is pretty much, you're just sitting in, as a tank, you're just sitting in front of Valarial and just smacking it around. You might be taunting the ads and using reflective plate, but this is a very easy parse. This is pretty much as close to a dummy parse as you can get, and you can see here that's reflected in the Alkosh uptime. It's 52%. So again, we take 52, multiply that by 2940. It gives us 3636, which is about a 900 additional penetration over Torugs, which makes this an easier sell to make. Again, but remember, this is only with one tank, so kind of want to take that into consideration. If you have two tanks, you might get even higher Alkosh uptime. So now let's take a look at a parse that has two tanks. Let's see here. This is Possessed Manticora from SO, a trial that requires two tanks, and both tanks in this case were wearing Alkosh. I was one of them. So if we take a look at the Manticora, this isn't necessarily the best one, because obviously the off-tank needs to go down the hole with the strategy that we're using. So we only got 33% uptime on Alkosh, so, you know, again, a hard sell to make. If we take a look at Stonebreaker, we got Alkosh 33% uptime. The other tank didn't get any of his Alkosh procs off, so this is pretty much a one tank Alkosh uptime, so 33% again. Very difficult to sell if you're only getting 200, 300 additional penetration on average compared to Torugs. And finally, this is the Serpent. So I didn't actually get any Alkosh procs off, I don't think. No, I didn't. But so again, 34% uptime on the Serpent here. So that's, again, it's just a very difficult sell to make. If you can get Roar of Alkosh uptime up to about 50% or 60%, it becomes a lot more viable to use in trials, because now you're getting at least 1,000 additional penetration compared to using just Torugs. And you also have to remember, Alkosh, the debuff is not up all the time. So when Alkosh is not up, you're losing out on that 30-10 penetration. So all you're getting is the Crusher enchant, so you're losing out on about 600 penetration or so compared to Torugs Pact. But on the other hand, when Alkosh is proc, you're getting that additional 30-10 or 29-40 or whatever have you, Alkosh penetration. So, you kind of have to figure out for yourselves in your groups, what kind of Alkosh uptime can you expect. If it's going to be about 30% or so, it's going to be a very difficult sell to make. The uptime that you need on Alkosh in order to match Torug's Pact is actually 22% uptime. So if you get 22% uptime on Roar of Alkosh or lower, just use Torugs, because in that case it's just there's no difference at all. But anything that's like 30s, 40s, it's something that you're gonna have to discuss within your own group, because of that whole, is it worth that extra 300, 400 penetration? Looking at uptimes, is it worth it to lose out on that 600 penetration when Alkosh isn't up? And is it, even though you get the bigger debuff when Alkosh is up, it's not up all the time. So, how do you want to play around with that? So the guilds that I run with, we don't use Alkosh, precisely because of the inconsistency in uptimes. We can have 50% uptime on some cases, we can have 30% uptimes in other cases, and so it's a very variable thing that you're going to have to consider when you are joining a Trials guild. Do they use Alkosh? Do they use only Torugs? Do they use Torugs and Alkosh? The best of both worlds. Are the tanks comfortable using Torugs and Alkosh and giving up basically either Ebon or Plague Doctor? So the best of both worlds would be you have one tank running Torugs, and the other tank running Torugs and Alkosh. And that way you always have the Torugs debuff up, and then you have Alkosh up. Ideally, you have both tanks running Torugs and Alkosh, but then you also have to remember you're giving up on the Ebon health boost to the group, and is that worth the drop in survivability compared to basically maximizing your DPS by pretty much having the best debuff sets in the game? So that's kind of where things sit when we talk about Torugs versus Alkosh. So my recommendation is try out Alkosh in your Vet Trials group, use it, see what kind of uptimes you can get after each fight, and do keep in mind that there are going to be fights where your uptime's necessarily going to be lower because you have to play mechanics, and then go from there, and then talk among the raid lead and talk among your group yourselves to discuss what would be easier. Would you rather prefer the consistent uptime of Torug's Pact and give up a little bit of penetration, or would you rather have the inconsistency of Alkosh, but when you do have that Alkosh proc up, have a very large debuff on the enemy? And that's something that each group is going to have to decide for themselves. Again, the best way to go of both worlds would be to run Torugs and Alkosh, but then you're giving up Ebon. So that's another option that you can discuss with the group as well. Are your DPS comfortable enough losing out on the Ebon health buff in order to get Torugs and Alkosh? Or, is one of the tanks comfortable enough with their survivability that they're able to run Torugs and Alkosh? So for me, for example, I'm very comfortable with my survivability as a tank, so I know the mechanics of each trial very well, so I'm comfortable when I'm off tanking running Torugs and Alkosh to give everybody that extra boost on Alkosh, even if the uptime is only about 30 to 40%, because we're still getting that Torugs uptime, but we're also getting Alkosh on top of that, so that's kind of a boost there. So that's something else that you're gonna have to kind of talk about in your group, whether you wanna do something like that. So hopefully that kind of gives you guys a little bit of insight as to which sets you want to use, whether you want to use Torugs or Alkosh or both. So I hope you guys found this video informative. I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.